Hi and welcome to another gaming video, and in today's video I want to talk about how I think Nintendo should re-release the Game Boy in a more modern form. So I'm not talking about a new platform under the Game Boy name, but I'm talking about an actual Game Boy but modernised. So retro gaming is huge, and there's lots of portable handheld emulators. Lots of them look like Game Boys actually. So you've got things like the Retroid Pocket or the Mayu Mini, and these are all great, but they all rely on emulation and ROMs, and that's not exactly a legal route. You do have the Analog Pocket. This is a modern day Game Boy. It will play Game Boy cartridges as well as Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance out of the box. They do also sell, add-ons I would call them, so that it can play Neo Geo cartridges, Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx cartridges. But out of the box it will play Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance on modern hardware. But it is very expensive. You're talking about £300 if you can find one. So if Nintendo were to re-release the Game Boy, and I'm talking mono, so original Game Boy, in sort of Game Boy Pocket size, put in a rechargeable battery, add in USB-C charging, give it a backlit IPS display, it would be superb. So I've been thinking about this for a little while, and I've been playing Game Boy games on my DSi, and it's got a beautiful backlit crisp display, and it really makes Game Boy games pop. So if Nintendo were to go down that route, they wouldn't have to give it as many bells and whistles as something like the Analog Pocket. Really, just no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no storage, because then people couldn't stick their own ROMs on and it would enter that grey illegal area, because Nintendo wouldn't go for that. It would just be rechargeable in a smaller form factor like the Game Boy Pocket, with a brilliant screen. People could then dig out their old Game Boy cartridges, play them. Developers could even make new games, because I know there's a lot of indie developers around that still make Game Boy games, and these new Game Boy games would even work in the older hardware. And it would bring sort of retro gaming back to the mainstream a little bit. It would also give Nintendo a new portable. It would get their foot back in the portable range, because they've always been king of handhelds with the Game Boy and the DS range. And the Game Boy has a huge library. I think there's about 3,000 games for the Game Boy. And I think it would be great. If you didn't build in all the bells and whistles that you had on an Analog Pocket, you could keep the price really low. It purely would be a Game Boy with a better screen and rechargeable battery, and that would be fantastic. I think it would really revitalise the Game Boy, and it would bring Nintendo into this retro gaming world, because original hardware for the Game Boy at the minute is expensive. You're looking about £80 for an original Game Boy, about £60 for a Game Boy Pocket, and about £60–70 for a Game Boy Color. If they were to bring out this Game Boy, this modern Game Boy, and price it right, sort of around maybe the £70–80 mark, it would be fantastic. If we're going to go and have a look at names, which I've touched on briefly with a few people, my son said it should be called the Game Boy Man. Don't like that. It's a bit cheesy. I know where he's going with it, because it's, well, you had a Game Boy when you were growing up, and now you're a grown-up man. No, I don't like that. I thought about maybe the new Game Boy, because when they brought out the 3DS and then they brought out the new 3DS, that's the naming convention they went with. I think they need to stick with the Game Boy name and build it in there somehow, so maybe new Game Boy would be a good thing. But I'd go for it. I've had experience of playing Game Boy games on modern screens, and they're fantastic. And yes, you can buy IPS display mods for original Game Boys, Game Boy Pockets, Game Boy Colors, Game Boy Advances, and the modern world absolutely raves about them, and it really does look good. If you've ever seen a Game Boy with an IPS display in, the games just take on a whole new feel to them. So if Nintendo were to jump in on that and bring out this modern Game Boy with a great display, I think it would be great. I think it would. I mean, Nintendo have this reputation for reselling and recycling old games on newer platforms. So yes, you can play some Game Boy games on things like the Switch and DS, but it's virtual console, it's reselling. This would be a way of Nintendo giving back to the community by releasing new hardware that could play old cartridges, and there's plenty of old cartridges around. They could even re-release some games and go that way, so re-release them on physical cartridges that would play on this new hardware and the older hardware as well. It might do something for Nintendo's reputation in terms of this recycling on new systems. I mean, I don't. Super Mario World for the SNES, how many times has that been rehashed and put on different systems at a cost each time? Whereas if they were just to bring out some hardware, and they'd obviously have to release a few games or re-release a few games with it so that you could buy games, but the main priority of it would be so you could play your old cartridges on this new hardware. And I think it would be great. The more I think about it, the more I would go and buy one. I think I would stick with the mono. I don't think I would go Game Boy Color and revitalise that, because the Game Boy Color was alright. It was kind of like a little add-on for the Game Boy. I don't think it did that well. There was a few good titles on there. A lot of the Game Boy Color games would play on a Game Boy anyway. There was quite a short amount of games that were Game Boy Color only. So it would be a fantastic thing to do for Nintendo to bring out this new Game Boy. I think that's the name I'm going to go with. I've not seen anything in the news. This is not me picking up on some sort of leaked hardware. It's just something I've been thinking about for a little while, and what a good idea. My son's got a Game Boy Pocket. He loves it. It relies on batteries and the screen is terrible. If they were to bring out a Game Boy with this new screen technology and rechargeable battery sort of built in, I think he would go for it as well. So let me know what you think. Would you be interested in a new Game Boy, or has that ship sailed for Nintendo? Or maybe the retro world wouldn't take too kindly to Nintendo jumping in on it. Let me know what you think. Link, like, subscribe, enjoy.